I still see the yellow stain on the basement floor. It's thin, maybe the size of a dinner plate, right where the old concrete meets the cinder block wall. It wasn't paint. It wasn't oil. And the moment I saw it, I knew my life in Havenwood, the quietest little apple town in America, was over. I had always assumed the worst thing that could happen here was a bad crop year. I was wrong. The worst thing was already here, hiding under a tarp and smelling faintly, sickly sweet. My name is Mike. I'm 32, and my family has owned this apple orchard, Miller's Pickings, since 1948. Havenwood is the kind of town where nothing changes. The high school mascot is still a barn owl. The diner still closes at 8 p.m. sharp, and everyone leaves their keys in the ignition. Or at least they used to. 2 weeks ago, I started cleaning out the old storage barn, the one we haven't used properly since Grandpa died. It was buried in junk, rotting crates, rusted tools, maybe a century of dust. The barn has a shallow, poured concrete basement for root storage, mostly empty now. It was in the furthest corner of that dark, damp cellar, behind a stack of busted pallets, that I noticed the tarp. It was a heavy, military-grade green canvas, neatly folded and covering something long. Way too long to be a spare tire or a forgotten engine block. Curiosity, the dumbest human emotion, got me. I hooked my finger under the edge and gave it a tug. Underneath, there was a shallow, freshly dug trench. It wasn't big, maybe 6 feet by 3. Someone had clearly tried to re-level the dirt afterward. But in a 100-year-old basement, disturbed earth looks like a bruise. And that's where I saw the stain. It had seeped up from the dirt and spread a little on the concrete lip. It was the color of old mustard, but thicker. A horrible, metallic sweet smell hit me. Something like cheap cologne trying to cover up something rotten. It was faint, but once you smelled it, you couldn't unsmell it. I dropped the tarp. My heart wasn't pounding. It was stuttering. What did I just find? The reasonable answer in a small town is nothing. Someone buried a dead dog or some spoiled meat. But the trench was perfectly sized. And the stain, it felt too final. I spent the next 3 days trying to ignore it. I moved the pallets back. I told myself it was fine. But every time I walked past the barn, I felt the pull. The stain was calling me back. On the 4th night, the fear became an itch I had to scratch. It was a cold Tuesday just past midnight. The moon was a sliver, and the orchard was black. The only sound was the wind chimes on the back porch, sounding like shivering glass. I crept back to the barn with a small shovel and a headlamp. I didn't tell my wife, Sarah. Couldn't. I needed to know, and if I was wrong, I didn't want her to know I'd gone crazy over a patch of dirt. I dragged the tarp off. The air in the cellar was thick and still. I shined the weak beam of my headlamp onto the trench. It was so simple, so horrifyingly understated. I started digging. The dirt was loose, easy to move, which meant it hadn't been there long. 10 minutes in, the smell got stronger. That horrible synthetic sweetness mixed now with the unmistakable copper tang of old blood. I was sweating not from effort, but from sheer terror. My shovel hit something solid. It wasn't a bone. It was smooth, hard plastic. I clawed the dirt away until I uncovered it. A long, rectangular plastic storage tote, the kind you buy at a big box store, taped shut with heavy-duty black electrical tape. What kind of person buries garbage in a Rubbermaid container? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife I brought. I sliced through the tape, pulling the lid up just an inch, just enough to peek inside. The smell exploded into the air. It was chemical, overwhelming, like bleach and perfume fighting a losing battle against decay. I had to step back and gasp for air. When I finally braced myself and lifted the lid completely, I didn't find a body. That somehow would have been simpler. What I found was clothes. Not just old clothes. They were neatly folded. A woman's floral sundress. A pair of white canvas sneakers, untied. And a small, silver-plated watch. All saturated with that same brownish-yellow residue, stiff and slick. Underneath the clothes, There was a single laminated ID card, a driver's license. I wiped the dirt off the plastic with my thumb. The name on the card was Laura Jenkins. She was 24. Her face stared back at me. A nice, open smile, brown hair tied back. Laura Jenkins. I knew that name. 3 years ago, Laura had vanished from Oak Ridge, the town 30 miles east of Havenwood. They called her a runaway, assumed she'd gone to the city. The story faded fast. Now, her things were buried under my orchard barn. This wasn't a runaway. This was a murder. And the murderer had used my family's property as a secret vault. I stumbled out of the basement, my headlamp beam dancing wildly on the concrete walls. I ran blindly until I hit the orchard rows. The trees, usually comforting, looked like silent, skeletal witnesses. Who put it there? When? Grandpa had been sick for years before he died last fall. The barn had been unlocked the whole time. Anyone could have slipped in. But the idea that someone from Havenwood, one of my neighbors, someone I saw at the post office or the diner, could be a killer, it was paralyzing. I went back inside, sealed the tote, and recovered the trench, working faster this time, driven by sheer panic. I had to call the police, of course, but the small-town police chief, Sheriff Dale, was my dad's golfing buddy. If I told Dale I dug up a dead woman's clothes on my property, what would he think? Would I become suspect number one? After all, the evidence was on my land. I went to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every car passing on the highway sounded like the police arriving. The next day, I started my investigation, playing a dangerous game of local detective. I drove to Oak Ridge and went to the only place I knew, the library archives. I looked up old articles on Laura Jenkins. She worked at a bookstore. She lived alone. She had a boyfriend, a transient named Gary who worked odd jobs across the county. The police cleared him quickly, saying he'd left town before she vanished. But what if Gary didn't leave? What if he came through Havenwood? That evening, I was pruning the back rows of the orchard, the ones bordering the thick pine woods, when I found the second piece of the puzzle. It was shoved deep into the hollow of an old apple tree stump, a small, dark brown leather wallet. I opened it, gloves on this time. Inside, besides a few crumpled dollars, was an old, faded picture. A younger Laura Jenkins, smiling, standing next to a man with a thick, untidy beard. Underneath the photo, scrawled in faint pen, was one name, Jake, not Gary. Who was Jake? And why did the police focus on Gary? I looked around. The woods were dense. The back of the orchard was remote, easily a 5-minute drive from the nearest house. It was the perfect dumping ground. As I stood there, examining the photo, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. My blood ran cold. "Mike, what are you doing out here so late?" It was Mr. Henderson, my closest neighbor, walking his golden retriever. He's been here longer than my family, a quiet man who always wears the same faded blue jacket. I shoved the wallet deep into my jacket pocket. "Oh, hey, Mr. H. Just finishing up a little pre-winter pruning. Got to get these old stumps out before the snow." He gave me a slow, unsettling smile. "That old barn of yours. Grandpa always kept it locked up tight. You should too. You never know who's walking through these woods at night." He stared at me for a beat too long. His eyes, usually kind and watery, seemed to hold a flicker of something else in the twilight. A sharp, knowing intelligence. He wasn't looking at the stumps. He was looking at me. "Well, you have a good night, Mike," he said, turning his dog. I stood frozen until they were gone. Did he know about the barn? Did he see me digging? Or did he know about Laura Jenkins? The idea that my gentle, elderly neighbor might be a cold-blooded murderer was absurd. But in a town this small, where everything is hidden behind a white picket fence and a polite wave, the simplest explanation is rarely the truth. And the killer, I realized with a sickening jolt, wasn't someone who passed through. The killer lived here. I have the clothes, the ID, and now this picture of Jake. I can't go to the police yet. Not until I know who Jake is and how this connects to my neighbor, or anyone else in this quiet, treacherous town. I have proof of a crime, but I also have a killer breathing the same apple-scented air as me. And they know I've been near the barn. The night is closing in now. I'm sitting in my kitchen, the wallet tucked inside a flour canister, staring out the window at the absolute, terrifying darkness of the orchard. I keep thinking about the clothes, how neatly folded they were. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was organized. It was local. And I have a terrible feeling that the next piece of evidence, maybe the final deadly piece, is waiting for me not in the ground, but in the reflection of my own window. I have to find Jake before the killer realizes I found the wallet. The question isn't what is buried in the orchard anymore. The terrifying question is, who knows I found it and what will they bury next? Story 2. I moved to Stillwater Valley for the silence. That was my mistake. They don't call it Stillwater because the river's calm. They call it that because nothing alive moves here anymore. I inherited my uncle's old hunting cabin, 20 miles outside the nearest town, Cold Creek, a place so small the welcome sign is just a painted-over piece of plywood. The cabin sits right under the shadow of Black Mountain. I thought I was getting peace. What I got was a trap built entirely out of trees and fog. The cabin itself is nothing special. 2 rooms, no cell service, and electricity that flickers when a squirrel sneezes. I came here a month ago to finish writing my thesis. The solitude was perfect initially. The only people I ever saw were the 2 brothers, Dale and Roy, who run the rundown hardware store in Cold Creek. They always gave me the same blank, unblinking stare when I bought supplies, like they were watching an animal they knew wasn't long for the woods. The trouble started with the deer. I'm used to wildlife. Bears, coyotes, sure. But 3 weeks ago, I found a dead deer lying 50 feet from my porch. It wasn't hit by a car. It wasn't shot. It looked wrong. Its eyes were wide open, white, and glazed. But the oddest thing was the lack of blood. There was a small, clean puncture wound, almost surgical, right behind its ribcage. And the animal was dry, completely drained. I shrugged it off. Maybe some strange predator? Mountain lion? I dragged it into the deeper woods, trying to forget the sight of the empty carcass. 2 nights later, I woke up to a noise, not a branch breaking, but a rhythmic metallic scrape coming from the front porch. I froze in bed, listening. It wasn't loud, but it was relentless. I crept to the window, pulling the edge of the flimsy curtain aside. The moon was full, casting harsh, cold light across the clearing. At first, I saw nothing but the wooden railing of the porch. Then slowly something moved. It was low to the ground, a shadow long and thin. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It moved in jerky, unnatural bursts like an insect, and it was doing something to the foundation of the cabin. I couldn't make out details, but I saw something long and pale extending from the shadow, dragging across the rough wood. That was the scraping sound. Whatever it was sharpening something. I didn't move for an hour. The scraping stopped just before dawn, and I heard a quick, soft shushing sound, like dry leaves being swept away, and then silence. Complete, total silence. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed the old 12-gauge shotgun Uncle left and flew onto the porch. There was nothing. No footprints in the hard-packed dirt. No dropped feathers or fur. Just the faint, metallic smell clinging to the damp morning air, like rusted iron. But when I checked the base of the cabin, the heavy wooden supports that rest on the stone foundation, I found the evidence. Thin, hairline scratches, concentrated right around the lowest support beam near the front door. They weren't claw marks. They were too thin, too straight. They looked like someone had been meticulously scoring the wood with a knife. Why would someone or something be scratching the foundation of my cabin in the middle of the night? I drove into Cold Creek that afternoon. The store was deserted except for Dale and Roy behind the counter, looking identical in their greasy work shirts. I tried to be casual. Funny thing, I've had some animals acting strange up at the cabin. Heard some weird noises last night. Dale looked up, his eyes narrow. What kind of noises? Hard to describe, like metal dragging, almost like someone was sharpening something. Roy didn't look up from stacking cans of beans, but I noticed his hands paused, holding a can midair. Dale just grunted. Bears sharpening their claws. Or the wind happens up on Black Mountain. He didn't offer sympathy or advice. He offered dismissal. Have there been any missing persons or strange events around here lately? I pushed. Dale finally met my gaze, a slow, humorless smile spreading across his face. This valley doesn't lose people, son. We keep what we have. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I bought my supplies, extra fuel for the lamp, canned food, and a new box of buckshot. I left, feeling the weight of their combined stare on my back until I turned the corner. Did that count as a threat, or just a creepy local joke? I returned to the cabin and spent the rest of the day fortifying it. I boarded up the windows that had old, broken latches. I set a simple tripwire of empty cans tied to fishing line around the perimeter. I was convinced whatever was scratching the wood wasn't an animal. It was a person, and that person had been keeping an eye on me. That night, the tension was physical. I sat in the dark living room, the shotgun across my lap, watching the front door. I hadn't turned on a single light, relying only on the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. Around 1 a.m., the scraping started again. This time, it wasn't at the foundation. It was at the back window, the one I hadn't been able to fully board up because the frame was rotted. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. It sounded different now, less metallic, more like a thick fingernail dragging across the glass, slow and deliberate. Then, the sound stopped, replaced by something far worse. A soft, drawn-out sigh right on the other side of the glass. It wasn't a human sigh. It was too deep, too airy, like something immense trying to quietly empty its lungs. I held my breath, my grip white-knuckled on the shotgun. A moment later, a shadow slid across the window pane. It was too large to be a human head. It was wide and flat, blocking all the moonlight. And then, slowly, a single pale eye appeared in the sliver of glass not covered by the shadow. It wasn't the eye of an animal. It was round, glossy, and completely black. It stared directly at where it knew I was hiding. I didn't move, couldn't scream. The fear felt like a vice squeezing my chest, robbing me of air. The shadow moved away from the window, and I heard a faint, shifting sound near the rear wall. It sounded like the clattering of small stones or, worse, the tiny crunching of gravel under a heavy foot. It was circling the cabin. Then the cans on the tripwire outside the front door rattled once, sharply, and stopped. Whoever it was, they were smart. They knew my pathetic defenses. I knew I couldn't stay. If it was human, they were sadistic and persistent. If it wasn't, I didn't want to know. My only chance was the old woodshed, 50 yards behind the cabin. It had a reinforced metal door where Uncle stored his tools. I could lock myself in there until dawn. I took the shotgun, crept to the back door, and slipped out into the cold night. The forest was an inkwell. I ran low, sticking to the edge of the tree line. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Halfway to the shed, I heard a whistle. It was a low, melodic tone, almost a lullaby, coming from the direction of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it carried perfectly in the still night air. It sounded like someone calling a dog. I ducked behind a massive boulder, my heart slamming against my ribs. I risked a peek back at the cabin. That's when I saw it. Standing on my porch, silhouetted against the cabin door, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like dirty, light-colored cloth, like a sack. It was facing the shed. It was looking right at me, and it was whistling. The sound stopped. The figure raised a hand. It was long and spindly, and it pointed directly at the boulder I was hiding behind. Then the figure started to move. It was slowly, steadily, coming straight towards me. Its movement was too smooth, lacking any of the small stumbles or shifts a human would make on uneven ground. I scrambled up, turning and plunging deeper into the woods, abandoning the woodshed plan entirely. The trees were my only cover now. I didn't stop running until the first faint pink of dawn started painting the eastern sky. I made it to the narrow, overgrown logging road, gasping for breath, the shotgun now heavy and useless in my hand. I kept running until I hit the paved county road, where I finally collapsed. I looked back at the shadow of Black Mountain, looming huge and dark in the distance. What was that thing? Was it human? Was it wearing something? And why was it draining the deer? I managed to hitch a ride with a logging truck heading south. As we passed through Cold Creek, the driver pointed out the window at the dilapidated hardware store. "See those two old fellas in the window? Dale and Roy? They've been there 50 years. Never leave the valley. They say they're the only ones left who remember the old ways up on the mountain." I looked at the store. Dale and Roy were standing by the window, both of them staring straight at my truck. They weren't waving. They weren't smiling. They were just watching me leave. And for a split second, I swore I saw a faint, dry, yellow stain on the chest of Dale's shirt, the color of old mustard, the same color as the dry, hollow ground around the base of Black Mountain. I never went back to Stillwater Valley. I abandoned the cabin, the thesis, everything. Now, years later, every time I hear a low whistle on a quiet night, I look over my shoulder, convinced that whatever came to my window that night didn't want the cabin. It wanted the life inside of it. And I still wonder, did they let me leave, or did I simply escape the first time, knowing they are still waiting for me to come home? Story 3. The first thing you notice about Harmony Falls isn't the waterfall, which is pretty, but the silence. It's a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet, like the air itself is listening. I moved here after my wife left, seeking a place where I could disappear and finally finish my memoir. I bought a small, cheap bungalow on Elder Street. Everyone waved. Everyone smiled. It was the kind of town where people brought you apple pie the day you moved in. I thought it was quaint. I thought it was welcoming. I was an idiot. I didn't realize that in Harmony Falls, a welcome meant you were cataloged, claimed, and never allowed to leave. It started small with the little details that felt wrong. My name is Ethan. I'm a writer, a naturally observant, neurotic person. In the first few weeks, the neighbors, the Jensens across the street, and the elderly Mrs. Albright next door were overly friendly. They knew I liked black coffee, even though I only drank it inside my house. They knew I spent Tuesdays at the tiny town library, even though I drove an unmarked car and kept to myself. "Did you find that new dictionary useful, dear?" Mrs. Albright asked me one morning as I was getting the mail. "The big red one with the worn spine? Ist here." How did you know I was looking at the dictionary? She just gave me a soft, fluttering smile. "Oh, honey, in Harmony Falls, we just know things. We look out for each other. It's why we're such a safe community." That phrase, "in Harmony Falls, we just know things," became a cold knot in my stomach. Then came the physical intrusions. I'd leave the house and find something altered. Not stolen, not damaged, but shifted. I'd put my old baseball cap on the kitchen table before bed. In the morning, it would be hanging neatly on the coat rack. I'd leave a half-finished glass of water on the nightstand. When I woke up, the glass would be rinsed and sitting in the dish rack. It felt like someone was silently walking through my house every night, tidying up my messes, marking their territory. I started locking the doors, deadbolting the windows. I even duct-taped the little ventilation slots near the laundry room. But the subtle shifting continued. One morning, I found a book on my shelf, a thriller by Stephen King, turned spine out. I knew I had left its spine in. It was a message. We were here. We are still here. Was I losing it? The isolation, the stress of the move, the lack of sleep. Was I just creating patterns where none existed? I decided to test them. That evening, before bed, I took a single small silver paperclip and wedged it almost invisibly into the crack between the door and the frame of my bedroom. I used a flashlight to ensure it was deep enough that a casual breeze or even a rough door closure wouldn't dislodge it. I went to sleep feeling marginally safer. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was check the door. The paperclip was gone. Not fallen, not bent. Just gone. I felt the blood drain from my face. Whoever was coming into my house wasn't forcing the lock. They had a key. Or they were watching me so closely they knew exactly where I kept my spare. This wasn't random break-ins. This was constant surveillance. The entire town was operating like a single quiet organism. I drove into the woods that day, desperate for a signal, a lifeline. I climbed a massive granite outcrop and finally got 1 bar of LTE service. I typed out a quick email to my sister, keeping it vague. Feeling strange at Harmony Falls. Neighbors are odd. Think someone has keys to the house. Will call tomorrow. Love, E. I hit send. The signal immediately dropped. When I drove back into town, I stopped at the general store for gas. The owner, a beefy man named Carl, was already pumping the gas. "Beautiful day, Ethan," Carl said, not looking at me. "Say, that sister of yours. Hope she's not too worried about you. Sounds like you're having trouble adjusting to our little town. Sending out those midnight panic emails." My vision tunneled. I didn't say a word. How did he know? The only explanation was the single, fleeting bar of service I had on the mountain. They had intercepted it. How did a small-town store owner have the capability to intercept private cellular data? "Don't worry," Carl added, leaning against the pump. "We all get a little anxious when we first move in, but we're here to help you settle. We keep our people close." He tapped the side of his nose. I drove home terrified. I packed a small bag, essentials, cash, and the biggest, heaviest flashlight I owned. I had to leave. Tonight. The tension in the air was so thick I felt like I was swimming through it. I waited until 3 a.m. The moon had dipped, and Harmony Falls was swallowed by the darkest part of the night. I crept to my car, parked in the driveway. I turned the key. Nothing. Dead battery. I tried again. Nothing. Panic flared hotter than the summer air. I hadn't used the car in 2 days, but the battery had been fine. It was a deliberate, planned move. They had disabled my escape route. I had one option: walk. I slipped out the back door, heading through the dense, shadowy backyards toward the main road. I needed to get past the town limits, just 3 miles to the state highway. I was moving silently, adrenaline making my steps lighter than air, when I reached the end of Elder Street. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't a shout or a siren. It was a low, rising hum. It sounded like dozens of people, maybe hundreds, humming a single, sustained, discordant note. It was coming from every direction at once. I peeked around the corner of the last house before the main drag. The entire street was full of people. The Jensens, Mrs. Albright, Carl, the store owner, even the teenage girl who worked at the tiny laundromat. They were all standing perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder, facing me. They weren't holding weapons. They weren't running. They were just standing there, blocking the street, humming that horrible, vibrating note. Their eyes, in the faint starlight, I could see them. They were unblinking. They didn't look angry or threatening. They looked empty, like religious figures or statues waiting for instruction. The humming grew slightly louder, vibrating in my teeth. I backed up slowly, silently. I turned and ran the other way, deeper into the residential sprawl. I ducked down a narrow alleyway behind the butcher shop. I stopped, gasping for breath, clinging to the shadows. I looked back toward the main street. The humming was fainter now, but it was moving. It wasn't staying on the street. It was spreading out, encircling the neighborhood. I realized what this was. This wasn't a mob. This was a net. A perfectly synchronized, quiet hunt. I started running again, desperate to find a break in the perimeter. I cut across the churchyard, jumping over low stone walls. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, loud and clear, right next to me. "Ethan, you really should have just stayed put." It was the voice of Mrs. Albright. I spun around. She was standing 10 feet away, leaning against the large oak tree near the rectory, wearing her pale blue nightgown. She must have moved silently through the yards. She wasn't running. She was just waiting. "You have a good life here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We take care of all our people. We keep them safe from the outside world. All you have to do is accept the peace." What was the peace? The silence, the surveillance, the complete control. I didn't answer. I turned and sprinted, smashing through a row of thick, thorny hedges, tearing my arms up. I could hear the humming close in behind me now, and the faint, unsettling sound of dozens of bare feet padding lightly on the grass. I ran until I found an old drainage pipe under the road. It was narrow, choked with mud, but it was my only chance. I plunged into the cold, fetid darkness. I crawled for what felt like miles, the smell of rot and sulfur overwhelming me. I could hear the humming directly above me for a long time, the sound muffled but constant, like a hive looking for a missing drone. I finally emerged near the state highway, far past the town limits. My body was shaking, covered in mud and blood. I walked for 3 hours before a trucker picked me up. I never looked back at Harmony Falls. Now, I live in a big city. I have triple locked doors and security cameras. But every time a crowd goes silent around me, every time someone smiles a little too long, I freeze. Because I know they still exist. I know they didn't catch me, but they also didn't give up. I left the town, but I didn't escape the net. Do they know where I am right now? Is that gentle, persistent humming just waiting for the city noise to quiet down, so I can hear it once again? Story 4. We all have secrets in Red Clay Hollow. Our town is built on an abandoned mining operation, and the only thing heavier than the red dust is the quiet weight of the past. My secret wasn't a crime at first. It was a responsibility. I was the one who drove the old pickup truck every Friday night, just after 2 a.m., out to the dry creek bed behind the old timber mill. I wasn't dumping garbage or contraband. I was just retrieving the lockbox, a heavy metal thing chained to the root of a massive willow tree. Grandpa started this chore, then my father, and now me. It was simply the protocol. I never knew what was inside, and I never asked, until the night the lockbox wasn't there. I'm Ben. I'm 37, and I run the only garage in Red Clay Hollow. Life here is slow, predictable, and frankly a little miserable, but it's mine. The protocol was the only break in the routine, and for years it had been clockwork. Drive out, unlock the chains, pull the box out of its shallow hiding spot, swap it with the identical, empty box I brought, rechain it, and drive back. Simple, private. The night I went out 3 weeks ago was cold and clear. The kind of night where the stars look close enough to touch and every sound carries for miles. I parked the pickup a quarter mile from the creek bed, just like always, and walked the rest of the way with the lockbox and my special key. When I reached the willow tree, everything looked normal. The ground around the thick root was covered in pine needles and mud. But when I got down on my knees and started sweeping away the camouflage, I felt the immediate, sickening cold of empty space. The lockbox was gone. The chain, too. It hadn't been cut or broken. It was unlocked, lying neatly coiled beside the deep impression where the box usually Saturday. Someone hadn't stolen the box. Someone had followed the protocol. My heart hammered against my ribs. Who else knew about this chore? Grandpa died 15 years ago. Dad died 5 years ago. I assumed I was the last link. I felt a surge of pure, primal panic. I looked around wildly. The mill was a dark, hulking silhouette. The woods were vast and silent. I ran back to the truck, forgetting the empty lockbox and the coiled chain. My mind screamed one question: what was in the box? I drove home and didn't sleep. The next day, I started my own terrified investigation. I had to know what was missing before whoever took it decided to come after the one person who knew about the creek bed. I went through Grandpa's things, old journals, dusty account books. Finally, tucked into the spine of an antique Bible, I found a single brittle yellowed page. It was a handwritten ledger, titled simply, "The Reserves." The names were listed in careful cursive: Baker, Finch, Dale, and a date next to each one spanning the last 50 years. Beside the dates were amounts. Not money, weights. Baker, 1968, 182 pounds. Finch, 1974, 145 pounds. Dale, 1989, 201 pounds. They were all names of people who had vanished from Red Clay Hollow over the decades. People the police called runaways or drifters who moved on. People the town forgot about quickly. At the bottom of the list, written in my father's familiar, hurried hand, was the last entry, ES, 2018, 115 pounds. ES, that was Eleanor Sims, a college student hitchhiking through the area 6 years ago. She disappeared without a trace. I dropped the paper. The lockbox wasn't holding cash or deeds. It was holding proof. Something taken from these people. Something heavy enough to need a lockbox. What did 115 pounds represent? I realized then what the true protocol was. The protocol was an insurance policy. It was the town's way of securing the silence, maybe holding something valuable that kept a powerful, hidden person or organization from exposing the town's ugly secret. I drove to the mill during the day. It was eerily quiet. The whole place was shuttered. But I remembered a rumor Grandpa always told me. Deep beneath the mill, connected to the old mines, was a hidden processing room. That night, my paranoia was acute. I couldn't trust anyone. My neighbors, the sheriff, a quiet man named Tom who had inherited the badge from his father. Everyone was potentially involved. I snuck into the back of the mill property. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay. Using the old access tunnels Grandpa had described, I managed to get inside the mill's lowest level. The place was a labyrinth of rusting machinery and damp concrete. Finally, I found it. A reinforced steel door, disguised by stacked lumber. I used a heavy pry bar I'd brought from the garage. It took 20 minutes of backbreaking, nerve-wracking noise, but the hinges finally groaned and gave. I stepped inside. The room wasn't large. It was clean, unnervingly so. And in the center, on a steel table, was a sophisticated scale. The kind used by jewelers, but much larger. And next to the scale, sitting under a bright, clinical lamp, was the missing lockbox. It was open and empty. I approached the table, shaking. My eyes immediately went to the wall above the scale. There was a shelf, and on the shelf were rows of small, dark, neatly labeled vials. Each vial had a date and a name matching the ledger. I grabbed the vial labeled S, 2018, and held it up to the lamp. Inside was a thick, reddish-brown, crystallized substance. It wasn't blood. It looked like dried, processed marrow, or some kind of high-grade biological powder. They weren't just killing people. They were harvesting them. And the lockbox was how they securely exchanged the processed product with whoever was running this operation. As I stood there, frozen in horror, the steel door slammed shut behind me. I spun around. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the weak light from the mill, was Sheriff Tom. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was wearing old, stained coveralls, and he was holding a coil of the same heavy chain that I found by the creek bed. "You shouldn't have broken the protocol, Ben," the sheriff said, his voice flat, emotionless. "It's been running smooth for 3 generations. Your family protected the reserve. It wasn't your place to ask what was inside. Eleanor Sims was just passing through. She was a kid," I stammered. The sheriff took a slow step forward. "The reserve protects Red Clay Hollow. It pays for our quiet life. keeps the mill running, even when it looks abandoned. We provide the ingredients and they provide the prosperity. That's how the town survives. It's always been family business. He glanced at the empty lockbox. They came early for this month's transfer. But you found the ledger. You found the room. That's a massive breach of contract. He raised the chain slightly. I liked your father, Ben. He knew his place. He understood the danger of letting the wrong people know about the product. I lunged towards the steel table, grabbing the vial of Eleanor's remains. I'm calling the state police. I have the evidence. Sheriff Tom just sighed. A tired, patient sound. The phones in the hollow only call out to the county office, Ben. And the county office knows exactly what those vials are used for. They're the buyers. He took another step closer now. Don't fight it. It's less messy that way. The wait isn't what they want anymore. It's the silence. I threw the vial at him and bolted for the small utility door I saw in the corner. I burst through it, finding myself in a narrow, pitch-black crawl space. I could hear the heavy thud of the sheriff's boots behind me. I ran blindly, knowing I was trapped beneath the town, in the old, complex tunnels of the mine. I crawled until I hit a wall of loose, crumbling clay. I clawed at it, desperate to dig my way out, my lungs burning. Was there any way out of this town? Was the entire county complicit? Was the piece of red clay hollow paid for by the lives of transients? I hear the scraping of the sheriff's boots now, moving through the darkness. He isn't rushing. He knows I'm cornered. He knows the weight of my life will just be another number in the ledger. I cling to the vial, the last piece of proof, knowing that even if I die down here, I broke the silence. But the sheriff is closer now. I can smell the iron scent of the mine and something else. Something sweet and chemical. I think I hear him whistling. The question burns in the dark. How many other small towns have their own protocol? And is there anyone left who can stop them? Story 5. Oakhaven Head is defined by its fog. It doesn't roll in. It lives here. It's thick, salty, and suffocating, swallowing the sunlight most of the day. My grandfather was the last official lighthouse keeper before the automation 10 years ago. He left me his little cottage right beneath the beacon, a place I hoped would be a perfect escape from city life. But a week after I arrived, I learned the fog isn't just moisture. It's a veil. And when the thickest pea soup fog rolls in, something ancient and hungry comes with it. I'm Clara, 29, and I moved to Oakhaven Head expecting quiet afternoons and salty breezes. Instead, I got the locals. They're the kind of people who look through you, not at you. They run the single bait shop, the dry goods store, and the one diner, all with the same pinched, wary expressions. They kept warning me about the high tide fog, urging me to keep my windows locked and my lamps lit. When the water's highest, the fog's the thickest. Old Mr. Silas at the bait shop told me, his voice a low rasp. And when you can't see the light from the head, nothing can see you. I brushed it off as local superstition. Until the first night the high tide fog truly hit. It was a Monday. The siren on the lighthouse, normally a reassuring, low moan, started sounding broken. A choppy, sputtering sound, like it was struggling to breathe. Outside, the visibility dropped to 0. The air tasted metallic and cold. I was reading when I heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. A soft, wet thump on the front deck, followed by a light, dragging scrape. My cottage is built on stilts above the rocks. Anything on the deck should be human or a large, clumsy sea creature. I held my breath, gripping the book so tightly my knuckles were white. The sound moved to the glass door leading to the deck. Scrape, scrape. It sounded like a thick, heavy glove dragging slowly down the pane. Then it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy with anticipation. I crept to the window and slowly, cautiously, peered through the heavy, swirling vapor. I couldn't see the railing, couldn't see the ocean. Just the cold, gray blur of the fog. Then something happened that made my entire body seize up. A hand appeared, pressed flat against the glass. It was huge, unnaturally long, and the skin was the sickly, pale white color of something that had never seen the sun. It wasn't a human hand. The fingers were too long, too slender, and they ended in blunt, curved pads, not fingernails. It didn't move. It just stayed there, pressing against the glass, making a slow, damp sound. It was simply observing. I backed away silently, stumbling over the rug. I grabbed my phone, but of course, out here on the head, there was no service. I was utterly alone. I spent the next hour pressed against the wall in the hallway, listening. The thing never tried to force the door. It seemed content to just wait. Finally, just before dawn, as the tide began to pull out, the thickest part of the fog began to lift. The scraping sound returned, moving back across the deck, followed by two more heavy, wet thumps as whatever it was dropped back down onto the rocks. Then silence returned, clean and final. When the sun finally burned through the last of the haze, I checked the deck. There were no footprints in the salty residue. But on the glass door, right where the hand had rested, was a thick, oily smudge, and beside it, wedged into the door frame, was a single gift. It was a small, perfectly carved piece of driftwood, smoothed by the sea into the shape of a human ear. I threw up immediately. This wasn't a warning. This was a tribute. What kind of creature carves wood? What kind of thing leaves a token after it watches you sleep? I didn't call the police. Who would I call? The sheriff, who looked like he hadn't slept since 1985. Mr. Silas, who seemed to know this would happen. I needed answers from my grandfather's things. I went up to the lighthouse and unlocked the small, unused office he kept there. Tucked into a leather-bound logbook, I found a series of entries written in his cramped, looping hand. The entries weren't about ships or weather. They were about the tithe. He wrote about the old ones, deep sea creatures that lived in the submerged caverns below Oak Haven Head. They didn't want gold or money. They demanded the gift of observation. They came out during the thickest fog, and they watched the land dwellers. The lighthouse, he wrote, wasn't there to guide ships. It was there to warn the old ones when the tide was right. The entries grew frantic near the end. They're getting bolder. They left a token for the Johnson girl. They want closer now. I can't keep them satisfied just by turning the light. They want interaction. The final entry, dated the day before he died of a sudden, unexplained illness. I left a gift by the cottage, small enough to pacify them. It has to be perfect. The old ones want perfection. I realized with a crushing horror. My grandfather had been leaving these gifts, carved objects, perhaps taken from previous victims, to appease the watcher, and now that responsibility had been passed to me. But what was the ultimate gift they truly wanted? That evening, the tide started rising early. The fog was already creeping in, damp and cold. I didn't wait. I ran down to the beach, flashlight in hand. The tide was churning, and the waves were black. I started digging in the sand near the waterline, exactly where Grandpa had described a hidden compartment. I found a heavy, oil-stained wooden box. I opened it. Inside was not another carving. It was a small, leather-bound journal. The pages weren't paper. They felt like dried kelp. And inside were crude, horrific drawings of human anatomy, diagrams of joints, eyes, and lungs, and a simple, recurring phrase scrawled across every page. The observer needs new eyes to truly see the land. I threw the journal down. They didn't want carvings. They didn't want blood. They wanted sensory organs. They wanted to know what it felt like to be human. I looked up. The fog was now complete. A thick, blinding wall of gray. And I heard the sound again. Not the scraping this time, but a quiet, hollow tinkling, like small stones being knocked together, coming from the rocks directly beneath the cottage. I grabbed the journal and ran for the stairs leading back up to the head. As I reached the top step, I glanced back down at the beach. Two shapes, taller than any human, dark against the gray mist, were standing right where I had been digging. They were impossibly thin, moving with a jerky, wet grace. And one of them waved, a slow, deliberate motion with that unsettlingly long hand. I ran into the lighthouse and slammed the steel door. I scrambled up the spiral stairs toward the massive Fresnel lens, the only thing that felt safe. I reached the top and looked out the thick glass. I couldn't see the cottage. I couldn't see the town, just the swirling, hungry fog. Then I saw it. Pressed against the glass right next to the massive, bright light was the hand. It was the same pale white, flat and enormous. It was several stories up. It must have scaled the outside of the tower. It slowly began to drag its blunt pads across the thick glass, making a sound like heavy, wet sandpaper, and then a new sound, a deep, bubbling gurgle right on the other side of the glass. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like pleasure. It had found me. I am locked in a tower with a monstrous entity on the outside glass, and the only light I have is what attracts it. I gripped the logbook, the terrible knowledge heavy in my hands. I have to get out of Oakhaven Head. But how do I escape a town run by ancient secrets, especially when the creature outside my window is finally close enough to receive my gift? The terrible question I face is this: will I offer them a token of silence, or will I offer the last thing a writer should ever lose? Story 6. Oak Hill County is nothing but corn. Endless, towering rows that stretch to the horizon and block out the sky. I moved here with my elderly Aunt May after she inherited a small farmhouse near the county line. The town itself, Hush Grove, is barely a cluster of 15 houses and a grain silo. The locals were farmers, of course, polite but distant. They never talked much. They never smiled much. They mostly just looked at their feet and said things like, "The corn has its own schedule." I learned quickly there are rules in Hush Grove. Rules about where you walk when you talk and what you don't look at. Breaking a rule isn't just rude here. It's a risk of the highest order. I'm David. I'm 24, and I came here to take care of Aunt May, who was becoming increasingly frail. Our farm was surrounded by the massive acreage owned by the Garrison family. They were the oldest, richest, and quietest people in the county. Their fields abutted our property on 3 sides, closing us in. The first rule I broke was looking out the wrong window. Aunt May always insisted I keep the heavy blinds drawn on the west side of the house, which faced the dense Garrison fields. She said the sunlight would ruin the wallpaper. One afternoon, while she was napping, I got curious. I slipped into the dusty parlor and pulled up the blind. The view was overwhelming. Corn, corn, corn. But right in the middle, maybe 100 yards away, was a small, perfectly circular clearing. It looked unnatural, like a bowl scooped out of the towering stalks, and in the center of the clearing, something was standing. It was a figure, tall and draped in what looked like dark, mud-caked burlap. It wasn't moving. It was just facing the house, facing me. My skin went cold. I slowly dropped the blind. That evening, when I went to collect the mail, my neighbor, an old man named Mr. Crowley, was leaning against his fence. He didn't look up. "Newcomers always look west," he mumbled, spitting tobacco juice onto the dry ground. "That's how they learn the fastest." "Learn what, Mr. Crowley?" I asked, my voice shaky. He finally looked at me. His eyes were dull, but his gaze was razor sharp. "Learn that you don't look at what belongs to the schedule. The corn doesn't like to be watched. It gets restless." I went back inside, thoroughly unnerved. The idea that the cornfield was watching me was absurd, but the figure in the clearing wasn't. I started paying attention to the sounds at night. It's never truly silent in the countryside. There's wind, crickets, frogs. But in Hush Grove, the night had a strange, low-frequency sound. A soft, pervasive rustling that didn't stop, even when the wind died down. It sounded like many things very close together, moving slowly. 2 days later, the second event happened. I drove into town to get medicine for Aunt May. As I passed the Garrison fields, I noticed that the circular clearing was gone. The corn stalks had completely filled in the space. The field was now one seamless, impenetrable wall of green. But as I drove past the spot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Standing right at the edge of the road where the corn met the gravel was the burlap figure. It was facing my car, and its head tilted slowly, deliberately, as I drove away. It was confirming my observation. Was the clearing a trap? Was the figure moving through the fields faster than I could drive? The paranoia began to consume me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tracked, step by step. I started setting small traps around the house, thread tied across the back porch steps, flour dusted lightly on the windowsills. Every morning, the flour would be pristine, but the thread on the steps would be cut cleanly right in the middle, not broken by an animal, but snipped by something precise. The night of the full moon was the worst. Aunt May was asleep, and I was sitting in the dark kitchen, too scared to turn on a light. The rustling outside was deafening. It sounded like thousands of tiny, dry whispers. Around 2 a.m., I heard a new sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from the back porch. It sounded like something heavy and soft hitting the wood. Repeatedly. Thud, thud, thud. I gripped the heavy, antique poker from the fireplace. My hands were slick with sweat. I had to know. This wasn't just observing. This was deliberate contact. I crept to the back door, peered through the small peephole. I could only see the small section of the porch directly in front of the door. The light from the moon gave the scene a sickly, monochrome glow. The source of the thudding was a bucket, an old, rusting metal pail, sitting upside down in the middle of the porch. Something was inside the bucket, hitting the wood. I slowly, very slowly, unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just an inch. The thudding stopped instantly. Silence descended so heavy it was painful. I waited for a full minute. Nothing. I kicked the door open completely, aiming the poker at the bucket. The porch was empty. The bucket was gone. But where the bucket had been sitting, there was a message. It was written on the dusty wood in a thick, sticky liquid. "We saw you watching." The liquid wasn't paint or mud. It smelled sweetly metallic. The color was a dark, dried reddish-brown. Blood. And then I noticed a second detail. Tucked into the crack between the floorboards was a single, shriveled object. I picked it up with a paper towel. It was an ear of corn, but every single kernel had been meticulously removed. Except for two. The two remaining kernels were perfectly positioned to resemble a pair of small, dark eyes staring up at me. I realized the horror of the schedule. These people weren't just farmers. They were part of some horrible, quiet, agrarian cult. The corn wasn't just a crop. It was a disguise. The schedule dictated when they moved, when they watched, and when they collected their tithe. I ran to Aunt May's room, shaking her awake. "We have to leave now. Get dressed. We're driving to the city." Aunt May sat up slowly, her frail hands adjusting her shawl. Her eyes, usually soft and cloudy, were unnervingly clear. "Leave, dear?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "But the harvest is next week. We can't leave before the harvest." I stared at her. "Aunt May, what are you talking about? Who is we?" She smiled, a slow, vacant, terrifying smile. "You looked west, David. That's not wise. But don't worry, the Garrison family is very patient. They knew you'd look. They knew you'd be curious. You're exactly the right age and the right weight for the schedule, dear." I backed away from her bed. She wasn't frail. She was a gatekeeper. She hadn't brought me here to care for her. She had brought me here as the next seed. I turned and sprinted for the front door. I didn't care about the car. I ran out onto the gravel driveway. The air was heavy. The rustling of the corn was now directly on the edge of the driveway, sounding like 1,000 hushed voices chanting. I saw the shapes move in the blackness. Not one burlap figure. Dozens. They were stepping out of the corn, surrounding the house in a wide, silent circle. They weren't running. They were walking slowly, purposefully. I ran into the street, away from the house. Then, I heard Aunt May's voice behind me, louder now, stronger than I'd heard it in years. "Go back to the parlor, David. The light is coming from the west now. You have to look again." I stopped. I looked back. The burlap figures had parted, forming a clear lane from the street back to the parlor window. And through that window, from the direction of the cornfields, was a blinding, unnatural white light. It wasn't the moon or a car. It was the purest, coldest light I'd ever seen. I stood frozen in the middle of the street. The figures were closing the circle. I could hear them shuffling in the darkness. What is in the light? What are they harvesting? Was my own aunt part of the conspiracy that delivered me here? I didn't turn back. I bolted down the main road, the shrieking, dry rustle of the surrounding corn right behind me. I can still hear that rustle now, in the middle of the day, in the middle of a big city. Because I know one thing. The harvest schedule in Hush Grove is year-round, and the corn never forgets the face of the one who looked too closely. Story 7. My cousin, Leo, told me about the cut. It's a forgotten slash of land outside the small town of Blackwood Creek, deep in the Appalachian foothills. It's not on any official map because the only road leading in collapsed years ago. Leo, a reckless historian, convinced me to join him on a hiking trip there, claiming there was a perfectly preserved 19th century cabin untouched by the world. He was obsessed with its inhabitants, the Pryor family, who supposedly vanished overnight in 1898. We made the long, arduous climb in. But the moment I saw the cabin, standing gray and silent in the perpetual shadow of the ridge, I knew the Pryors hadn't vanished. They were just waiting for someone foolish enough to read their secrets. I'm Jake, a geography student, and my interest in this trip was purely academic. Leo's was something darker. When we reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking, leaving the valley floor bathed in an eerie twilight. The cabin was beautiful but unsettling. The glass in the windows was intact. There were pots hanging in the kitchen. It was like a portrait paused mid-sentence. We spent the first few hours setting up camp and cataloging the bizarre details. In the pantry, there was a stack of canned food from the 1950s. In the bedroom, the linen closet held clean towels, folded with crisp, modern lines. "It's impossible," I kept whispering. "This place hasn't been preserved. It's been maintained." Leo, however, was ecstatic. He found what he was looking for, a handwritten ledger detailing the Pryor family's daily life. But the entries didn't stop in 1898. They went all the way up to last week. The last entry read, October 28th, checked the road trap, weather fine. Preparing for the guests. They always bring the noise. October 28th. That was 3 days ago. My blood turned to ice. "Leo, we need to go. Now, someone lives here. They know we're here." Leo, holding the dusty, thick ledger, just laughed. "If they wanted us gone, they wouldn't have left this out, Jake. They want us to read it. This isn't a family. This is a project." We argued until midnight. The fire crackled, the only sound besides the ceaseless, low moan of the wind coming through the high pines. I finally convinced him to pack up at dawn. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the image of the neatly folded towels, the sheer, impossible care someone had taken to preserve this charade. Around 3 a.m., I needed to get some water from the nearby creek. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and stepped out. The air was freezing, and the darkness was absolute. As I walked towards the creek, I noticed something shining faintly in the dark, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. It was too high to be a discarded can. I shined my beam on it. It was a small, crudely built wooden structure, like a birdhouse, nailed high up on a pine tree. As the flashlight hit it, a faint, rhythmic sound started coming from inside. Click, click, click. I crept closer. It wasn't a birdhouse. It was a small, homemade camera box, rigged with what looked like an old clockwork mechanism to take pictures at timed intervals, a surveillance box, and next to it, hammered directly into the bark, was a small hand-painted sign. The paint was fresh and still smelled faintly chemical. It simply read, "Do not adjust the subject's lighting. Who built this? And who was the subject?" I looked back at the cabin. The front door, which we had secured with a rope before we slept, was now wide open, a column of blackness leading into the pitch-dark interior. My fear became a physical pain. I ran back to the cabin, bursting inside. "Leo!" I hissed. He wasn't in his sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was empty, tossed carelessly on the floor. The fire in the hearth was still glowing, but on the small wooden table, right where he had left the prior ledger, was a single, crisp photograph. I snatched it up, my hands trembling. It was a black and white picture, blurry and grainy, clearly taken by the surveillance box outside. The picture showed the front porch of the cabin, and standing on the porch, facing the camera, was Leo. He was facing away from the cabin, and he was smiling a huge, vacant, unnerving smile. The photo hadn't been developed from film. It looked like it had been printed recently, maybe within the hour. I felt the blood drain from my head. How did they print a photo so fast? Where did they take him? And why was he smiling like that? I grabbed my pack and my hunting knife. I bolted out the back of the cabin, straight toward the thickest part of the woods, away from the collapsing road. I ran until I was exhausted, finally collapsing behind a thick cluster of rhododendrons. I waited, listening for pursuit, but there was only the wind. And then a new sound, a soft, rhythmic snapping. It was coming from directly above me. I looked up. High in the branches of the rhododendron bush, hanging from a thin rope, was a row of what looked like dried herbs. And in the middle of the herbs hung a cluster of tiny, polished bones. As I watched, one of the bones snapped clean off the string and dropped into the leaves right beside my head. Someone was baiting me, leading me through the woods. They knew where I was, and they were enjoying the hunt. I scrambled up and kept moving. I realized the Pryor family wasn't about history. It was about eugenics. An isolated community maintaining its own grotesque project for over a century. And Leo and I were the new guests. I ran into a clearing that smelled strongly of pine and dry earth. In the center was a huge, deep pit, too symmetrical to be natural. And then I saw Leo. He was standing at the edge of the pit, looking down. He was still wearing his hiking gear. He looked totally fine. "Leo," I gasped, stumbling toward him. "We have to leave. They took you." "They?" He turned. That smile was still there. Wide, fixed, and terrifyingly empty. "They didn't take me, Jake," he said, his voice flat, monotonous. "I helped them adjust the focus. The light has to be right for the subject to be cataloged." He stepped closer to the edge of the pit and picked up a shovel. "They said you're too frantic. Too much noise. But you'll be perfect for the base layer. Good density." I froze. He was holding the shovel like he was ready to use it. He was no longer Leo. He was a part of the project. I backed away slowly, drawing my knife. "What are you talking about, Leo? What is in that pit?" He looked down, his eyes glazed. "It's the foundation, Jake. All the old subjects. They make the ground soft. So when the new subject is set, it sits just right for the lens. It's the Pryor protocol." He raised the shovel. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, plunging into the dark woods. I can still feel his presence behind me, but he isn't running. He's walking slowly, rhythmically. He doesn't need to hurry. The woods are his. I'm lost in the trees now, deep in the cut. I know they aren't trying to capture me quickly. They are simply herding me towards the spot where the light is just right. How long have they been doing this? How many guests have contributed to the base layer? And how much longer until I am simply a smiling subject in a black and white photograph? Story 8. Hollow Creek boasts one historical landmark, a massive stone sundial right in the middle of the town square. It's old, maybe from the 1700s, and instead of Roman numerals, the hours are marked by strange, jagged carvings that look more like broken teeth than numbers. I inherited the local antique shop after my aunt passed, thinking I'd spend my days cataloging harmless relics. But I quickly learned the town doesn't measure time by the sun. They measure it by the debt. And the sundial isn't just a clock, it's a scoreboard. I'm Alex, 28. I'd only been in Hollow Creek for 3 months, and the town felt heavy, cold, and profoundly quiet. The locals, especially the older generation who still ran the government and the bank, referred constantly to the balance. The balance must be maintained. Alex, the mayor, a severe woman named Mrs. Thorne, told me once when I complained about the lack of modern amenities. We pay a price for this peace. It's an investment. I thought she meant taxes. I was wrong. The strangeness centered on the antique shop itself. Every year, on the night of the autumn equinox, someone would leave a small, wrapped parcel on the front step. Aunt Millie's ledger, which detailed years of mundane transactions, had a single, recurring entry for that date: debt paid, 1 unit. The first time it happened to me was last week. I woke up to a faint tapping sound at 4 a.m. I crept downstairs. On the dark, dusty welcome mat was a small, tightly wrapped parcel, secured with brown twine. It was about the size of a loaf of bread, and it felt heavy, dense. I brought it inside. It didn't feel like money or a gift. It felt organic. My curiosity, that terrible disease of the mind, took over. I cut the twine and carefully peeled back the heavy brown paper. Inside, resting on a bed of dried moss, was a single, perfectly preserved human heart. It was cold to the touch and strangely firm, like a dense fruit. It wasn't bloody. It looked processed, treated with chemicals or salts, gleaming with a waxy, unnatural sheen. It looked like something that had been prepared for a display case. I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My whole body vibrated with a silent, blinding panic. This wasn't an antique. This was a murder. A ritualistic payment. I frantically checked the sundial's ledger. The parcel was left on the autumn equinox. I rushed to Aunt Millie's old, coded notebook. I finally found a cryptic entry detailing the sundial's secrets. The 12 jagged carvings weren't ours. They were cycles. And each cycle required a payment to keep the balance. Millie's entry was chilling. The stone knows the measure. If the balance tilts, the creek demands 1:1, full weight. The unit must be whole or the town pays dearly. Keep the score, but never question the source. The unit must be whole. The heart was the unit. I went to the police, but the department was just Sheriff Brody, a man whose family name was one of the oldest in Hollow Creek. I tried to be vague. Sheriff, I found something disturbing, possibly animal remains. Something dropped off at my shop this morning. I think it might be connected to some weird local rituals. Sheriff Brody didn't look up from his coffee. This time of year, Alex, folks are preserving everything. Don't worry about it. Just keep your doors locked. The town takes care of its own things. You take care of yours. His indifference was worse than open hostility. It meant he knew. The town wasn't just covering up a murder. The town was the murderer. I drove out of town, desperate for cell service. I finally got a signal near the county line and called the state police anonymously. I gave them a vague location and the time of the drop-off. I felt a surge of adrenaline, believing I'd finally broken the silence. When I drove back into town, I saw Mayor Thorne and Sheriff Brody standing together near the sundial. They weren't talking to each other. They were looking at me. As I pulled up to my shop, I noticed something new. Someone had placed a small, simple bouquet of white lilies on the antique shop's doorstep. They hadn't been there when I left. White lilies are traditionally used for funerals. Was this a warning? A promise of what happens when the balance is threatened? That evening, I knew I had to run. I packed a small bag and grabbed the one thing I couldn't leave behind: the preserved heart, wrapped again in the twine. It was my only leverage. I waited until midnight. The whole town was dark, suffocated by the heavy silence. I crept out the back door and headed down the old logging trail toward the county line. I was moving quickly when I heard the sound. Not a car, not footsteps, but the slow, heavy grinding of stone. I stopped and looked back through the trees. The sound was coming from the town square. In the center of the square, illuminated by the moon, the massive stone sundial was turning. Slowly, agonizingly, with a sound like rocks chewing on metal. It wasn't moving with the sun. It was rotating against the moon's shadow, and standing around the turning sundial, silhouetted against the moonlight, were nearly a dozen figures. All the old families. Mayor Thorne, Sheriff Brody, even the quiet librarian. They were gathered in a circle watching the stone. Then, I saw what they were doing. They were adjusting the balance. As the sundial moved, the sheriff took a large, heavy mallet and struck the stone base once. The grinding stopped. The sundial rested. The sheriff then looked directly toward the logging trail, straight at me. He raised his hand and pointed not at me, but toward a spot near the center of the sundial. I glanced back at the stone. The heavy shadow cast by the gnomon, the arm of the clock, now fell precisely across one of the jagged carvings. The carving looked like a distorted, open mouth. And beneath the shadow, someone had scratched a new inscription into the ancient stone. It wasn't a date. It was my name. Alex. 170 pounds. I didn't wait. I plunged into the woods, running blindly. They weren't just covering a crime. They were performing a town ritual, a dark contract renewed annually. And by calling the state police, I hadn't exposed the crime. I had simply offered myself as the next whole unit to restore the balance. I hear shouts now, distant but moving closer. They aren't worried about me escaping. They're simply moving to collect the debt. I clutch the cold, preserved heart in my backpack, my only proof. I know they won't stop until the debt is fully paid. The last horrifying thought I have as I run through the dark woods is this: was the unit they left on my doorstep a warning to me, or was it a horrifying preview of the quiet, bloodless preservation they have planned for me?